The real story of the Hormuz shutdown is not that oil got expensive. The real story is that Canada suddenly stopped being a secondary supplier and started becoming a strategic answer. That is the line almost everyone missed when the Strait of Hormuz effectively shut down. The first reaction was obvious: panic. About one-fifth of the world's daily oil supply suddenly trapped behind one narrow waterway, 150 tankers stranded, prices surging past $100 a barrel, gas prices in Canada jumping 40 cents a liter in just 3 weeks. The International Energy Agency calling it the largest oil supply disruption in history. That was the visible story. But the more important story began after the panic, because once Hormuz stopped behaving like a trade route and started behaving like a battlefield, every industrial country in Asia had to ask a different question. Not where is the cheapest oil, not where's the closest oil, where's the safest oil that can still move now? That is the question that rewrote the map. And once that question took over, the answer was not Europe, and it was not some miraculous diplomatic reopening of the Gulf. The answer was Canada. That is what makes this moment so important for years. People treated Canadian oil politics as a local fight: pipelines, protests, carbon pricing, provincial tension, environmental lawsuits, federal hesitation. The whole thing looked domestic, messy, and faintly old-fashioned. But what global crises always do is reveal the hidden strategic value of things people were previously embarrassed to defend. That is exactly what happened here. Canada was sitting on a route that does not need to ask the Middle East for permission. That is the entire story. South Korea usually gets around 70% of its oil from the Middle East. That is not just a supply preference. That is structural exposure. If Hormuz becomes unreliable, South Korea does not experience that as a bad week in commodities. It experiences it as a direct threat to the machinery of its industrial economy. The same logic extends in different ways across much of Asia. Factories do not run on market optimism, they run on molecules, and the molecules have to arrive. That is why Asian buyers did not just need replacement supply. They needed politically boring supply. They needed a barrel that could move immediately, at scale, and without having to cross an active conflict zone. That is where Canada suddenly became invaluable. Official data released this week confirmed that Canada's refined petroleum sector posted its highest production year ever in 2025, reaching 117.1 million cubic meters. Crude output averaged 5.3 million barrels per Dalton Y. Those are big numbers, but big numbers alone do not matter in a crisis. The real question is whether those barrels can actually reach the buyer when the system around them starts breaking. That is where the Trans Mountain Pipeline changes the whole picture. For years, people argued over that pipeline as though it were just another infrastructure headache. But what it really built was optionality. It gave Canada a Pacific exit. It gave Canadian crude a route across the North Pacific that bypasses the Gulf, bypasses Hormuz, bypasses the Red Sea, and bypasses almost every major geopolitical choke point that turns an energy shock into a strategic panic. That route is long. But in a real crisis, long and safe beats short and dangerous. That is the shift the market used to reward pure efficiency, the shortest route, the cheapest route, the most optimized route. In the new world, when choke points can close overnight, the market starts rewarding resilience. The barrel with the safest route gets a premium. Infrastructure that looked politically exhausting in peacetime suddenly looks strategically brilliant. In wartime, that is why Chinese buyers became the single largest customer base on the line. That is why South Korean refiners activated emergency plans and turned toward Canadian crude. This was not sentimental. This was not ideological. This was systems logic. When the old artery breaks, the premium goes to the route that still works. And that is why I think the biggest misunderstanding in the coverage is the idea that Canada simply got lucky. Canada benefited because it had already built the one thing the world suddenly needed, a route out. That distinction matters. Luck is temporary. Route security is leverage. Now move south, because this is where the story becomes even more interesting for years. The standard assumption in Washington was that Canada needed the United States much more than the United States needed Canada in the broadest macro sense. That still contains a lot of truth. But digital markets have a way of humiliating political arrogance. The U.S. Gulf Coast is full of refineries designed for heavy crude. Those refineries do not run on abstract trade theory. They run on very particular inputs. Historically, the answer came from some combination of Canada, the Middle East, and Venezuela. Now, the Middle East is unstable, Venezuela is unreliable, and Canada suddenly has a direct route to Asia that allows it to sell secure barrels at a premium that changes the psychology of leverage. Canada is no longer just a smaller neighbor hoping to preserve access. Canada now holds a physical stream of supply that both Asia and the U.S. Gulf Coast want at the same time. That is not a talking point, that is bargaining power. And it becomes even more real because of what is coming next. In about 6 weeks, the Prairie Connector pipeline decision is due. If approved, it could move about 450,000 barrels per Dalton Y South to the United States. That does not just mean more throughput. It means another bargaining chip. It means Ottawa can enter trade talks, not just with principles and complaints, but with actual barrels on the table. That is a different kind of conversation. This is also why the domestic side of the story matters more than people think. When a sector this large breaks records in the middle of a global shock, the benefits do not stay trapped inside boardrooms. Pension funds gain, provincial royalty revenues rise, fiscal pressure eases, healthcare and infrastructure funding become easier to sustain. Even politically visible steps like the recent 10-cent cut to the federal fuel tax become easier to finance. That is the domestic meaning of leverage. It is not just export revenue, it is political room. And one of the most underrated political effects of strategic leverage is psychological. It changes the way a country feels about its own position. Instead of experiencing globalization as something that simply happens to you, you start feeling that you hold an asset other people have to adapt to. That is part of what this crisis did for Canada. It reminded the country that what looked like a messy domestic fight over infrastructure was in fact a long-term strategic investment. But this is exactly where the analysis has to stay honest, because the advantage is real. And the advantage is also temporary unless Canada turns it into something more durable. That is the next challenge. Middle Eastern shipping will eventually normalize to some degree. Some buyers will drift back to closer suppliers. The Pacific route also has hard physical limits. The West Coast system is currently maxing out around 890,000 barrels a day. That means this moment is not destiny. It is a window. And windows close. If Canada wants to turn this crisis into lasting structural leverage, it has to use the shock to secure long-term contracts, deepen strategic trade relationships with Asian buyers, and make itself not just an emergency substitute, but a permanent part of their planning. That is the real opportunity. And then comes the contradiction that no serious analysis can dodge climate, because record production creates immediate leverage. But it also sharpens the friction with long-term climate commitments. The more strategically useful Canada's oil system becomes, the harder it is to maintain the fiction that the country can maximize hydrocarbon leverage and keep every other political promise perfectly aligned. Contradiction does not disappear because the world suddenly wants your barrels. In fact, success makes the contradiction harder to hide. This is what real statecraft looks like. You do not get resilience without trade-offs. You do not get leverage without tension. You do not get strategic advantage without making another part of your national story more difficult to defend. That is not failure. That is adulthood. And that is why I think the deepest lesson of the Hormuz crisis is not simply that prices rose. It is that the global market quietly re-ranked what matters. The old ranking system rewarded efficiency. The new ranking system is beginning to reward security. The old system loved the shortest route. The new system pays a premium for the route that still functions when the shortest one becomes a trap. That is what Canada just proved. And if you want the whole story compressed into one line, it is this: when Hormuz stopped looking like a highway and started looking like a trap, Canada stopped looking like a backup supplier and started looking like the secure route the world suddenly needed.